one important thing I should say is that Bloomberg, a lot of times when mainstream media organizations have tried to get into games, they've done a half-ass way of doing it. They haven't put in the resources. They like bury the game section somewhere and then complain when it doesn't get any traffic, or like barely give any promotion to stuff. I have found the complete opposite at Bloomberg.
Welcome to Visionaries. I'm your host, Jacob Wolf, a former ESPN award-winning investigative journalist and the CEO and founder of Overcome. Today we're welcoming on Jason Schreier. Jason is a reporter at Bloomberg covering the games industry and the author of 2 books, most recently Press Reset, a New York Times bestseller that covers the inside of the games development industry. Before Bloomberg, Jason worked at Kotaku, the gaming culture website, and Wired, the tech magazine. He is one of gaming journalism's most seasoned veterans. Whether it's labor rights issues, game delays, or CEOs of multi-billion-dollar companies telling their employees to remain apolitical ahead of a monumental Supreme Court decision about abortion, and their desire to adopt a dog, the likelihood that Jason broke that story is very high. So who watches The Watchmen? Well, in this case, we're flipping the script on Jason, asking him about the power he holds as the beat's top reporter. Jason Schreier, welcome to Visionaries. So, hello everyone, welcome to Visionaries. I believe this is episode 11, if I remember correctly. I'm thrown off a little bit by the fact that we had a 2.5-hour episode a few weeks ago and ended up splitting it to 2 on the audio demand and video on demand feed because it was super long but super engaging. Anywho, welcome back to the podcast. Glad to have you here. If you're unfamiliar or a first-time listener, this is a show that is predicated around having some of the most successful and powerful people in all of gaming on the show twice a week. Today's guest is Jason Schreier, the longtime games journalist. I would say probably the most high-profile games journalist in the space when I think of our industry and the one that I work in every single day. And tomorrow we will be joined by Ludwig, the very high profile live streamer. We're supposed to have him on yesterday, but he is currently I think he's traveling today, but is currently in Panama on an island with Mr. Beast to create content and made that trip very last minute, so we had to reschedule anyway. And our past shows have included everyone from Mayahiga, Atrioc, James Bardolph, a very wide array of guests, and you can find those on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and YouTube. And that is in the pinned tweet above. Anywho, we're welcoming on Jason today. This was arranged prior to last week's sort of EA conundrum, but it's certainly something I want to talk about as we go through this episode. For those unfamiliar with Jason, he works at Bloomberg and covers the games industry, previously worked at Kotaku. And so, Jason, why don't we start there? How did you get started in this space as a journalist and find yourself at Kotaku eventually?
So first of all, I thought you were going to intro this by being like, we have the most successful and powerful people, and also Jason Schreier is here.
No, you are successful, Jason. You're successful and powerful. You work at the biggest business publication in the world and write about this industry from a pretty high perch. So
it is it's good to be here. Thank you for having me, Jacob. So I was interested in journalism and writing from a very young age. It's funny, I think a lot of people get into the games media space because they're interested in video games. They love video games and they want to work in the games industry, but I approached it from the angle of, well, I want to be a journalist, and so this space happens to be interesting and I want to cover it. So brief version of my origin story. Was on my high school paper, wound up becoming editor-in-chief of my high school paper, did some stuff at my college, NYU, did some newspaper stuff. And then after school, started freelancing, wound up getting kind of a permalance job for Wired, which was my big break in. Spent a couple of years there, and then went on to Kotaku for a long time. I was there for 8+ years, and now I'm at Bloomberg. And the way I stumbled into this is because after college, I had no idea I was going to write about video games. But I knew I wanted to do freelance writing of some sort. So I started getting all these different freelance gigs, including some that were in local journalism for the town in Westchester, New York, where I lived. And I wound up covering random things like a government board meeting. And so I wound up going to all these different board meetings, and I remember this. I have this vivid memory of sitting in this room where a bunch of old men are like sitting at a table on a podium with microphones, and they're arguing about whether a fence should be 20 feet or 30 feet. And at that point, I was just like, I need to be doing something more interesting. I'm going to kill myself if I have to keep doing this. So I was like, what about video games? I've always loved video games. Why don't I try that? And then kind of stumbled into, never thought I would stick with writing about this industry, but somehow stumbled into it.
It's interesting that you said you wanted to attack this, and I wanted to talk about this later, but I guess we'll address it now because you brought it up in that answer. It's interesting you said you wanted to attack this from a journalism perspective. I think the pipeline for current games journalists, esports journalists as well, is to be enthusiast pressed, right? They are players. That was my original background too. I didn't go to J school. I came up as a League of Legends and Call of Duty and Smash player, and then wanted to just start writing about this. However, kind of building that separation is really tough for a lot of games journalists. I think they're really hard at sort of stepping away and kind of applying the critical eye of a journalist. Some would say even sort of what's the word here? Pessimistic eye for in journalism that most people carry. But I want to ask you, like, was that something you struggled with early on, separating yourself from the game? And the second part of that would be what would be your feedback for the people who are dealing with that very specific issue?
Well, so, okay, I was very lucky in that I started my career having amazing mentors, and one of my first mentors was a guy named Chris Kohler, who ran Wired's video game section for a very long time, and he was one of the first editors that I worked with regularly. And one of the reasons he hired me is because I told him, like, hey, I'm willing to pick up the phone. Like, I see myself as a journalist first and like a video game fan second. I'm willing to make calls and piss people off. And I think that's what he was looking for. And he taught me a whole lot about journalism and reporting and the games industry and all sorts of cool things. And I think having really good, and then I would go on to have another one of the greatest mentors in Stephen Totilo, who's another phenomenal editor and reporter and writer. And so I think having really good mentors is really and you have to be, there's an element of luck there. But if you're lucky enough to have really good mentors, I think that will serve you well, because like as much as we all want to believe, our egos want to believe that it's all us, it's never all us. It's always like we're always the products of what we're learning and absorbing from the people around us. So that I think is one big aspect of this. Another thing is, I mean, from what I've seen in watching colleagues over the years is that a lot of people aren't really that interested in kind of confronting the disparity between like the gamer in them and the journalist in them, because a lot of people are frankly more interested in eventually getting jobs at game companies, and they're kind of working in press because it's fun to review games, it's fun to write about games. You maybe a lot of them don't want to burn too many bridges, and they just wind up taking jobs at game companies, which is, I mean, totally fine, like if that's what you want your career path to be. Some people also, I should say, are forced into it because games media does not pay very well, and if you want to actually make a career and have a family and make a decent enough wage that you can maybe buy a house one day, you might have to go into the games industry where you can actually make a living. But yeah, I think that like if you're struggling with, well, so are you talking about specifically struggling with like getting too attached to the beat that you're covering, or what is the problem that you're interested in kind of confronting here?
Yeah, specifically that, being able to separate yourself for the love for what you're covering, especially because it is an activity you participate in. It's not like certain other beats where you are separated. I mean, if you're covering venture capital or business, you're not participating in that while you're a journalist. This you can play the games that you are covering. You can be involved. But being able to separate that and still apply that like journalistic critical eye.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting challenge, and it's especially interesting when you know how the sausage is made, and you kind of learn more and more about the labor cost that actually goes into making these games that you're enjoying. I think it's absolutely very possible to love the product and cover the industry with a skeptical, rigorous eye. Not a rigorous eye, a skeptical eye, and a rigorous journalistic backbone. I think that in fact, I think it's kind of necessary, because games is it's such an insular beat. It's such a like specific beat, that if you don't know the games, if you don't love the games, if you aren't like keeping your finger on the pulse of all things EA and Activision and Take-Two and Ubisoft all the time, it's hard to like be really good at it, just because like it's one of those industries, I don't know, like sports, where you really have to immerse yourself in it. That said, I think that I've never really had a challenge. I've never really found it too difficult to like to write skeptically and critically about the companies that I'm covering or the products I'm covering, because I think part of love is doing that. Like, you can love video games and also want to see them get better, and also want to see conditions around them get better. In fact, I think that's a necessary part of like loving them, is wanting the best for them. And it's interesting. I always see on the critic side of things, as opposed to the journalistic side of things, and the critical side of things, reviewing side of things, you always see gamers being like, why are you writing all this negative stuff about games? Why do you hate video games? And it's kind of like, no, man, like, if you're criticizing games, it's because it comes out of love for them and wanting to like write incisive stuff about them, and help readers understand them, or think about them in a new way. And that's what's so interesting about criticism. You don't do criticism because you hate something. Like, if you hated games, you'd be like working in finance. You'd be you'd be doing something that pays better than this, that's for sure.
So I have both of your books on the shelf behind me, and have read
Nice.
read them. Something you've covered in a lot of depth is crunch, and in your work and in your books and everything else. Does the coverage that you've done, has it made you have a, even if not intended, adversarial relationship with a lot of the companies that you write about, just by reporting on that stuff?
Yeah, although not necessarily just because of crunch. I think a lot of times it's because you're reporting on inside info about them, or unreleased, talking about unreleased products, or talking about products before they're announced, and all sorts of stuff leads to adversarial relationships. But yeah, the labor conditions definitely. Crunch is always an interesting subject, because I think it gets it's become this boogeyman, and I actually think that it's a way more nuanced and complicated topic than people let on. It's also gotten much better. I've been talking to a lot of people recently about crunch in the 90s and early 2000s for some other projects I'm working on, and hearing those stories really puts in perspective what it's like today. But yeah, no, I mean, I think that like I won't get into like all of the nitty gritty about what crunch is, but in case people are listening or aren't familiar, it's essentially excessive overtime, often for weeks or months on end. And there are very many different kinds of crunches. There's some crunches that are healthier than others. There are some crunches that I think are easier on people than others, and it can be done well, but in general, it's not something that people want to do. Nobody wants to be in the office. Nobody wants to be working overtime for excessive periods of time. And this important distinction here: this is not like a week of overtime to finish a game. This is months on end.
Months, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's important. I'm really glad to be a small part of the conversation when it comes to like bringing it up more and seeing it talked about more and more on Twitter. When I see a company say that they've just delayed their most recent game, I see a bunch of responses being like, "Yeah, take your time, like work healthy hours, don't crunch to finish this thing, yada yada yada." And that's been really cool to see. It's one of the things that I think is important, is that there's been a lot more awareness of it in recent years. And yeah, I mean, if that pisses off the companies involved, so be it. I think that it's a necessary part of the job, and I think it's something that maybe not a lot of people want to do, because it doesn't feel good to have people pissed off at you or hating you. But if you're a journalist, you probably have to make a few enemies if you're doing your job right. I think the key is to make sure that you're making the correct enemies. But yeah, I mean, if you're a journalist for any significant period of time and you haven't made any enemies, then I don't know, maybe you're not doing, maybe you could be doing more. I don't know, maybe you could be doing more combative or adversarial journalism. Maybe not. Maybe it's not for everybody, but it's certainly something that I've experienced personally.
I doubt you experience this particular thing I'm about to describe as much anymore, considering the publication you work for, the power that it holds in the world, and the fact that any coverage is good coverage when it's in Bloomberg. However, I have had those adversarial moments with publishers in the past. I've had my credential lifted and revoked by both Riot Games and Activision Blizzard before to their events, and I've been pretty public, at least now all these years. I was told to shut up about it at the time by my employer. But even when I was at ESPN, it certainly put strain when those moments happened on my colleagues who covered it with that less sort of critical eye. They were, whether it be they were just doing games beat writing or like event beat writing in the case of esports. Did you encounter that much at all at Kotaku, where the stories that you were breaking were impacting the way that your colleagues had to have access?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I was pretty much single-handedly responsible for Bethesda blacklisting Kotaku, and to this day, both Kotaku and I am blacklisted by Bethesda. Bethesda still won't talk to me, even at Bloomberg. It's because of their one head of PR, Pete Hines, who has a vendetta against me. Yeah, no, it definitely impacts. It definitely makes things tougher. It definitely leads to difficult situations, but I don't think that any of my colleagues, I mean, I don't know, people out there can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think any of my former colleagues at Kotaku had a problem with that. I think we all were proud to be at a website that was willing to burn bridges with game companies and was fiercely independent. I mean, that's one of the things that was really great. And for all of the flack that Gawker Media, our former parent company, got over the years, some of it deserved, some of it not so much. They allowed us to be completely independent and autonomous. And if there was any pressure from our corporate side or ad side or anyone else, I never heard about it. I never once in my entire 8+ year career at Kotaku, I was never once told to not run a story because it might piss people off. So yeah, that I think is something to be proud of, and as a journalist, and it's something that I think if you worked at Kotaku, I think you had a little bit of, and still have, to this day, because there's still a lot of talented people at Kotaku, you still have this kind of almost like pirate spirit, the spirit of being this fiercely independent organization that is not afraid to burn whatever bridges. At Bloomberg, it's a little bit different because we have so many different reporters. Our newsroom is thousands of people, that if a company like Bethesda doesn't want to deal with me, they might go to another reporter. And then sometimes, because my colleagues are awesome here and they're also just incredible journalists, sometimes those reporters might be like, okay, we'll do this interview, but only if you talk to Jason, which will put those companies in pretty funny situations. But yeah, it's a little bit different at Bloomberg. But to answer your question, Bethesda still blacklists me. Other companies that have pretty hot and cold relationships with me, various companies. Sometimes I don't even know why. I'll send a bunch of emails to a PR person at a company and not get responses and be like, what did I do this time? Did I tweet something you didn't like, or what's the deal here? But yeah, it's part of the job. It can be irritating. I often wish that I had the chance to sit down with some of the talented game developers at a company like Bethesda, but it is what it is.
So you mentioned sort of the pirate mentality of the ex-Gawker Media websites. They are highly criticized for behavior quite frequently, and sometimes I would say they step a line that is not particularly appropriate. I've been the subject of a Gawker Media or ex-Gawker Media website story in which my age was purposely left out of an article written about some very offensive things I had said as a young teenager. And I don't hold that against those people, and actually have a good working relationship with the journalist that wrote that story all these years later. However, I certainly think that those websites, Kotaku, Deadspin, etc., carry a certain reputation that is not sort of highbrow investigative journalism sometimes, because they do things like that. More broadly, they cover things, or they write things that can be sort of, I don't even know how to describe it, but certainly what feels like a little bit less serious, and even not just less serious, but maybe a little unfair. Did that ever impact your work? / did you feel that, or having worked at some of those websites, when you're kind of out here trying to do high level business reporting in the way that you do?
No, and in fact, I was proud to work for a website where like I could run. I think my last two posts at Kotaku were one a follow up on Rockstar Games, which and talking about its working like a long piece about its working conditions that ran at like 1,500 words, and two like a 50-word nonsense post about the writer for Outer Worlds going to work for, or the writer for Outer Wilds going to work for Worlds, and how funny I thought that was. I was thrilled to work for a website that gave us the freedom to cover gaming, which is inherently a silly industry, both with the seriousness and the silliness that it deserves. Because I think that like I take my work very seriously, but I also think there's a lot of room for doing things that are funny and off the beaten path and weird, and certainly made my share of fuck ups. I don't actually remember the story that you're referring to. I'm not sure if it was Kotaku or somewhere else, but I don't think I had anything to do with that one.
You did
so
not,
I don't remember
no.
it. But I certainly, and I don't want to, I'm not going to speak for other people's stories, but speaking for my own stories, I've certainly made my share of fuck ups over the years. And I think part of that pirate ship mentality, part of having that freedom, it gives you the freedom to screw up as well. And I think that can be both a good and a bad thing. But there were many things I was proud of, including the fact that when we did screw up, we owned it. We ate shit. We didn't just like pretend that we didn't actually say that Amazon is buying EA. We said, hey, this is what we did wrong. Here's a correction. We apologize for the error. And that is something that I am very proud of, is that when we screwed up, we took responsibility for it. And sometimes people weren't happy with everything we did. Sometimes I certainly wasn't happy with everything Kotaku published. And we had plenty of internal battles and fights and squabbles over all sorts of things, as is healthy. For a news organization, sometimes maybe it wasn't so healthy, but I think it's pretty healthy to have a little bit of conflict in the newsroom. And yeah, I mean, I think that ethos that we had when I worked there, can't speak to things now, but when I worked there, the ethos that we had, I was very happy with and very proud of, and was I think Stephen Totilo, who ran the place, was very good at creating a set of editorial guidelines that we were all proud of. The one thing that I think is for example, one tenet that we always stood by is like, anytime you write about someone in a journalistic way, you call them, you email them, you reach out for contact.
Yep.
And if we ever didn't do that, that was a big screw up, and we shouldn't have done that. But like, that was a rule. Like, if we didn't do that, I mean, it was a screw up and an error, and someone made a mistake, but we should have done it, and we would always acknowledge, like, hey, we should have done that. But that's the type of example of I think a journalistic principle that we stood by, and I think was just yeah. I mean, we had plenty of principles like that. Is the point?
Yeah, Kotaku definitely breeded is it's even today, I would say, a talent farm. There are some people there that I certainly see that are kind of on their come up and rise that could be in positions like yours or mine here in the next couple of years, in terms of being able to either go independent or work for a major publication that's kind of outside the gaming space but still covering their beat. And certainly I think it has already done that with Steven and yourself and Cecilia and others as well. So
yeah, and I just want to say, I mean, I don't think, to answer your question, Rich, I didn't really answer about the whether the lowbrow nature of some of the stuff on the site impacted me. Absolutely not. Like, nobody, when people are reading a big investigative piece on Kotaku, nobody is like, oh, well, this also came from the site that like ran some stuff about anime, so it must be nonsense. No, they take it seriously, because we worked and put many years in and put a lot of time into making sure that when we reported this stuff, it was accurate and true and rigorous and thorough, and that it should be taken seriously. And as a result, when you saw a big Kotaku story, you knew it was not to be missed. And I'm certainly proud of that. And I don't think that, like, if it had been in the New Yorker, like it's not like it had just as much of an impact as it would have if it were published anywhere else, is the point. And it led to, I mean, my Kotaku work led to me getting a book deal, and then multiple book deals, and all sorts of other cool stuff for my career. So no, the low brow nature of some of our stuff on Kotaku did not negatively affect me in any way.
Understood. Taking a quick break from this episode to have a word from our sponsors. The journey of my career has been pretty fast-paced. I started writing at 17, and within 16 months, I went from having never written a published article to landing a job at ESPN as their youngest talent hire ever. With that fast-paced career, I've often found myself struggling with imposter syndrome and with work-related anxiety. But over the past few years, seeing a therapist really helped me guide my way. And if you think you may be feeling depressed, stressed, anxious, and overwhelmed, then today's sponsor, BetterHelp, is here to help you. BetterHelp offers licensed therapists who are trained to listen and help you. Talk to your therapist in a private online environment whenever's convenient for you. And if you're like me, where it seems there's never enough time in the day, you understand how important that convenience is. There's a broad range of expertise in BetterHelp's 20,000 plus therapist network that gives you access to help that may not be available in your area. Finding a therapist can be hard, but BetterHelp simplifies that experience. You start by filling out a questionnaire to assess your specific needs, and within 48 hours, BetterHelp will match you with a therapist. From there, it's easy. Schedule video and phone sessions, message your therapist as much as you want, whenever you need to, and everything you share is completely confidential. You can request a new therapist at no additional charge anytime. I've been seeing my therapist Diane for 4 years now, and when we reflect back on the progress I've made in my life for the better, it's a pleasant reminder of why I started seeking help and the goals I had when we first started working together. Join the 3 million plus people who've taken charge of their mental health with an experienced BetterHelp therapist. Get your 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/visionaries. That's betterhelp.com/visionaries. So you mentioned EA and EA and Amazon and the story that ran last week from For the Win, the newswire that has publishing rights on USA Today's, GLHF, which is a newswire that has publishing rights on USA Today's For the Win. I wanted to talk about this before that story even came out, given that we had booked this episode, but certainly want to talk about sort of the broader conversation and two parts of this, that one included, about the threshold of breaking a story, because clearly it seems like with that specific one, that was not met. We're both sort of speculating from the inside out, but the retraction was pretty damning, to say the least. So what, to you, when you're covering something like that, whether it be an acquisition or whether it be something around countries or companies, labor issues, etc., what is the threshold you have to meet, whether it be number of sources, the amount of information you're being given, documents, etc.?
So when it comes to a story that will move a company's stock like double-digit percentages, better be friggin' right if we're gonna publish something like that, or if I'm gonna put my name on something like that, better be right. I will probably err on the side of sitting on it unless I am 110% sure, like unless it is bulletproof, like I'm hearing it from the CEO, and even if I'm hearing it from the CEO, I'll probably want to corroborate it with someone else. Yeah, it's a tough one. I think that in general, my general rule of thumb is that I'm not going to publish anything unless I've heard it from two sources, ideally both firsthand. Sometimes if like one is firsthand and the secondhand person is like, yeah, I heard it from this other person, and tells me exactly who they heard it from, or like gives me full context on how they know it, then I'll feel comfortable running it. But ideally the threshold is two firsthand. In a perfect world, you would have at least three firsthand for any sort of story. And these are, when I'm talking about, like, that's just the baseline. So I wouldn't run anything, even if it's like the most like anodyne rumor. I wouldn't run anything without that baseline at least, and I don't think my editors would either. I've never actually talked to my editors about like what's our standard here, because I always come prepared with like at least two sources on every story we do. Occasionally I'll be like a one source story, but usually that's because it's like building on a story we've already done. So like maybe we have a story on, so for example, I did a story recently on Star Wars: The Knights of the Old Republic and how that studio behind it was running into issues, and eventually it was put on hold at that studio and moved to another studio. My original story was based on three sources, and then a source gave me additional info and I felt comfortable enough with the veracity of that source that I was able to, like, I added those details without necessarily second sourcing them, because there were a few granular details added to this story that I already know is true from other sources. So if you want to get into the nitty gritty, sometimes you can play around with that. But baseline, 2 people at the very least. Documentation is great, but like documentation in my world at least is so rare that that it's usually what I'm hearing is on my phone, is like people calling me or texting me or signaling me. So usually I'm just talking to a few different people. Usually people aren't just like throwing documentation at me, although obviously that stuff is great too. And always a gold mine when someone is like, here's a contract for the offer that we just got to be bought. And I'm like, fantastic, this is great. I think that happened to me with a game studio like 4 or 5 years ago, that someone actually leaked the contract, which was nice. Yeah, man, Amazon buying EA. I don't really want to shit on the reporter involved too much, because he seems like a decent guy. I certainly think that like when you make a screw up like that, you really need to be accountable for it and like explain what happened, and hold yourself to a standard where you will come out and like actually apologize and say how it happened and explain why it wouldn't happen again. But to each their own. For a story like that, yeah, I mean, I think that the standard certainly at Bloomberg would be extremely, extremely high before running anything like that.
Well, especially since you all have such an impact on Wall Street and the stock market as a publication.
Well, this did too. EA stock, man, sure. I remember that, seeing it that morning.
$6, yeah.
It $6 spike. Before it was up. By the end of the day, it was up $6. Before it was like, before the CNBC came out and denied it, it was up like 15% in the morning. It like really skyrocketed and then tanked. It was like, man, if you bought and sold EA at the right time on Friday last week, then you were in for a treat.
Another story I wanted to talk about this exact same thing on the vetting, because you got a lot of shit around this specific story. I think a lot of us did, but you sort of top among the rest of the journalists in the games industry, which is the Activision Blizzard sexual harassment story prior to the DFEH filing. When that filing came out, I saw a lot of people come after you and accuse you of holding a story and knowing about all of this for a long time. I've seen your responses about that, talking about sort of what you had heard versus what you hadn't, what was reportable, what wasn't. As someone who's published stories about sexual misconduct and also worked alongside the reporter that published the sexual misconduct story around Riot Games, being Cecilia, and the great work that she did around that, walk me through that and, you know, sort of what you had heard, and also why nothing ever saw the light of day. Like, why you couldn't get it across the finish line.
So funny. It's really incredible that has become a narrative. I think it's mostly Gamergaters, because it really started on r/Kotaku in Action and in those kind of cesspool social media sites, and then some of it has trickled out a little bit out of the Gamergate spheres, but it's mostly Gamergaters that have been saying that. And it's all based on a tweet that I sent after it broke, where I said essentially, truth is, like, this is me paraphrasing, but I said essentially, truth is, I've heard some stories about like issues like this at Blizzard over the years, and we'll be reporting on this lots more. So contact me if you have a story to share, or you want to share something about your experiences there. That was it. And that somehow turned into Jason Schreier sat on this for 3 years, because again, Gamergaters, I mean, they're like cretinists and don't have no idea what journalism is or what they're talking about. The truth is, every reporter and every person in the video game industry hears rumblings about all sorts of things all the time. And that doesn't mean that there's a story to them, and it doesn't even mean that there's anything you can do with it, because oftentimes it'll be like secondhand or third hand, or someone telling you a story that maybe isn't theirs to share. In this case, I had heard from a couple of women over the years, and had kind of in the back of my head somewhere, and was actually, I had actually heard that there was some sort of litigation going on, which actually prevented a lot of the women involved from speaking to me in the first place, which put a block on that sort of reporting. But it was certainly on the back burner to be like, need to look into this stuff, need to ask around some more, need to figure it out. and then the lawsuit came out, which oftentimes you need something like that as kind of the tipping point for a lot of other people to feel comfortable sharing their stories. And that ultimately led to a lot of great reporting. And we did a big piece on Bloomberg about the kind of the culture at Blizzard that created a lot of these issues that have been discussed in recent months. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding about what journalism is to think that someone should just be like out there like on a podcast every day sharing every single piece of rumbling info that they've heard, especially when it comes to something as serious as sexual assault. It's one thing, and sexual misconduct, it's one thing to be out there like some people are and just sharing all the gaming rumors you've heard, like, hey, I hear that Silent Hill is going to be announced next week, I hear that there's a Nintendo Direct. Like, that's totally fine and innocuous. To be out there and be like sharing every single serious story you've heard, that's quite another thing. And I think that the irony of gamergaters thinking that they're all about ethics and journalism while also propagating this this idea that I sat on a story as opposed to I was not reporting on something without having rock solid evidence and enough stories to corroborate it. Yeah, that's certainly ironic.
Yeah, understood. So if you want to submit a question for Jason, the pinned tweet at the top of the space, you tweet using hashtag Visionaries Podcast, and my staff will reach out to you to talk to you before we let you speak at the end of the space. We've already got a couple different questions, but we'll get to those at the end of the show, and look forward to hearing what everybody has to say. So, Jason, the next thing I want to ask about is the Microsoft Activision Blizzard acquisition. It seems like it's getting closer almost daily to actually being for real, pinned for summer 2023, and just cleared Saudi Arabian or regulatory clearance, which I don't know how much that really means for in a company that has a vested interest in pushing that one through. But certainly it looks like it's not going to have much opposition in America. There's been some timeline reporting around that it doesn't seem like there's been anything filed, at least by the Federal Trade Commission. And then it's making its way through the European system. So I think we're probably less than 12 months from it being a done deal. Is your expectation that it will close up?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been after seeing all the headlines and stories about Lena Khan, the new commissioner of the FTC, I have thought that she would use something like this as an example, but maybe not. I don't know. I don't. It's not clear to me yet. I don't know. Maybe you said that a deadline had passed or something like that. I haven't been looking at that super closely, so I'm not sure what the specifics are as far as when the FTC would need to make a move as opposed to or ask them for more information. And also, there could be a lot of that stuff happening behind the scenes. My kind of prediction was always that the FTC would like force some sort of guarantees out of Microsoft, like, hey, we guarantee we will not make Call of Duty exclusive to Xbox Game Pass or something like that, or like we will allow Call of Duty on other subscription services, because that's a big part of their focus when they're looking at the antitrust possibilities here. Is a lot of their big focuses on streaming services as opposed to the consoles, because Call of Duty is at least Microsoft has signaled that it's not taking Call of Duty off of PlayStation platforms or PC or anything like that. Well, I guess all of their games are on PC, but yeah, so PlayStation platforms. Yeah, that said, I don't know. It's tough to make a prediction on that front, but certainly people at Blizzard, people at Activision certainly expect that this time next year they will have new corporate overlords. For some people, I imagine that's a reason that they're sticking around in the first place, because I think a lot of people were unhappy with their current management, and knowing that the C-suite at Activision is going to leave when the deal goes through, I think is a big incentive for some folks over there to stay. But yeah, nobody really knows what's going to happen, and nobody knows what kind of redundancies Microsoft is going to find there. Activision Blizzard has its own publishing department, has its own marketing and comms and QA and all the other parts of the machine that keep publishing rolling, and Microsoft has their own people for all that stuff, so who knows what's going to happen there. Yeah, a lot of uncertainty. Who knows what's going to happen to esports? You and I were just talking about this before we started recording. Like, what's going to happen with Overwatch League, Call of Duty League? Does that really fit into Microsoft's portfolio? Lots of lingering questions. But to answer your question, it's hard to say what's going to happen. But yeah, at this point, it certainly doesn't seem like there's been any big obstacles or blocks or anything like that.
It's been smoother sailing, I would say, than I thought it would be as well. And the FTC has a now open antitrust case against Facebook that surrounds VR. And so I have a feeling that may be the gaming one that they take the swing at, right? They're trying to stop Facebook and Meta from acquiring Supernatural, arguing that they already have exercise games like Beat Saber, etc. So,
Yep.
yeah, that's
Yeah,
I think that may be the big swing.
That's another thing that kind of another head scratching moment with the whole Amazon EA thing was like, in this climate where the FTC is going after Facebook for that thing, like, is Amazon really going to make another bazillion-dollar deal here? Like, is that really something that's going to happen? Who knows? Maybe it'll get announced tomorrow, and maybe Amazon will buy EA tomorrow. But certainly led to a lot of questions last week.
I would be highly skeptical. I think it's way more likely it would be a company less involved in gaming, a la Disney, etc., if I had to speculate a little bit. So, something I want to touch back on the Microsoft front, and I want to hear your thoughts from how the PR campaign has been handled and everything else. One thing that has been really clear to me over the past two and a half years, especially around the release of the Series X in 2020, is that Microsoft has very heavily rehabilitated its public image in a lot of different ways to gamers. It feels like, the previous Xbox One was a dud, I would say, among the audience, like very universally hated after having a very successful lifespan of the Xbox 360 and the original Xbox. The company obviously went through its own significant sort of PR disaster in terms of it having its own issues with sexual misconduct and labor issues as well. And now it feels like they are in many ways the darling of the industry. I think a lot of people think very highly of Xbox. And I think part of that was to do with what I would call the Phil Spencer Brutal Honesty tour that happened in 2020 and 2021, where he was talking, and I saw Gene in the space earlier, and we wish Gene well, but talking to like Gene Park and having a really honest conversation that got published in the Washington Post, speaking to Kara Swisher, obviously a very influential tech journalist in her own right, and doing sort of this PR campaign and just talking about the mistakes very openly, not trying to sort of, deflect from them a lot. How do you think that Microsoft has been able to rehabilitate its image, and why do you think that is important heading into this acquisition, where it's really important for people internally at Activision Blizzard to feel like their company overlords are maybe a little bit more sensible and welcoming than their current ones like Bobby Kotick?
Yeah, it's interesting. It really is. So much of it is about putting a face on the whole organization. Phil Spencer is a really charismatic guy. He comes across as genuine. He's also the type of guy who you hear stories about privately about how he's a great leader and a good guy, and like seems to be a genuine person. I, as a journalist, am always by nature skeptical of powerful people, of people at the very tops of companies. But yeah, he's an easy guy to like, and it's easy to see why putting him being the face of this company, especially in contrast to the previous head of Xbox, Don Matrick, who is like as close to a car salesman as you could get, like a walking, talking, like, you almost expect him to be in like a Saul Goodman suit up on stage. It's the contrast is really apples and oranges, and Phil getting himself out there over the past few years. It started way before 2020, I would say. It's really been since he took over, and has just been making all these incremental moves. And then the other part of the equation is Xbox Game Pass, which is just such a good deal for gamers, and there are a lot of bigger questions about how it impacts the industry and the kind of the race to streaming and Spotify and all sorts of other bigger questions. But when it comes to game developers and people who make games, but from a gamer perspective, from a fan consumer perspective, that's an incredible deal. Like, you're paying, what is it, $10 a month, $15 a month for access to just like so many cool games and day one Microsoft games. Like, that's incredible. So that, like, you combine this like really likable head of the face of the company with that, and you got a winning formula. And then it seems like they've been making a lot of smart moves. Obviously, they've been making a lot of big acquisitions, and again, that's another thing where it's like for the industry and for ultimately for all of us, that might not necessarily be a good thing, and consolidation is never really a great thing. But if you're an Xbox fan, if you're like loyal to your Xbox console, suddenly you see this company that is like taking game development very seriously and building up its stable of games in a way that just a few years ago it didn't seem like Xbox was that interested in doing. I mean, 2013, I don't know if you were around for this, if you were covering games at this point, but I remember their big Xbox One announcement event, and man, it could not have gone any worse. It was just like Don Matrick taking the stage, like Phil Harrison, like all these kind of out of touch executives talking about TV and how your TV watching experience is going to be enhanced by the Xbox One. And they barely mentioned games, and Connect was a big part of it. And it was just a mess. It was just a disaster. And yeah, under Phil Spencer, things have gotten much, much better. And it also, as often happens, it also coincided with Sony making some boneheaded moves and PlayStation just like heading in the opposite direction. I mean, most recently, they raised the cost of their console in every country except for the US, which is just, man, talk about a self-inflicted wound. Not to mention the $70 games and like all sorts of other mistakes they've made. And it's kind of like the ebb and flow
and the Jim Ryan email that you published a few months ago as well about their stance on separating politics from the workplace, and in response to the leaked Roe v. Wade Dobbs decision.
Yeah, and how he wants to adopt a cat, or was it a dog? I forget.
It was a dog. It was a dog.
Yeah, and I've never met Jim Ryan. I don't know him or anything about him, but I don't think he has quite the public perception that Phil Spencer does at this point.
So, before we get to some of the audience questions, I've always wanted to talk to you about this privately, but also publicly, and I'm really curious about this as well. So, you are, like I started at the beginning of the episode, I think when we look at games journalism, you are the most successful games journalist in the industry. You are one of the lucky few of us, I would say, and this is making an assumption, but a fair one, I think, to be fairly well off in an industry that is very top heavy, where there's only a few of us that earn a pretty solid wage and the rest that really struggle to put things together all the time. And I'm privileged in that way too. And that's not to brag, but just to acknowledge that, I've been sort of in a similar boat. But one thing that has struck me is that, you're doing these books, you have the level of access that you have, and the, credit and history that you have in your reporting and the good work. Why have you chose to remain at a publication in a time where journalists feel like they're going independent and being incredibly successful at doing so?
Because Bloomberg has lawyers, and they're really good lawyers. To
be fair, as someone who publishes on Substack, there is a Substack fund that covers a lot of litigation. If anybody ever came after me, I'd be okay. So I don't know if it's just lawyers. What's the answer here?
No, it's an interesting question. And it's something, I mean, I won't lie and say that I haven't thought about all of my potential options. But I like first of all, I have a family. I just had another baby 3 weeks ago. So I have 2 kids, like having the stability of an organization around me, and health insurance, and vacation days, and like parental leave, which I'm about to take, and all of that good stuff that comes with the company. I really like my newsroom and my editors and the people that I work with every day, and I think I would really miss that if I ever went solo. I think I would miss just being surrounded by like a ton of talented journalists. Just a couple hours ago, we were doing a big Zoom call. The Bloomberg tech team was doing a big Zoom call to talk about my colleague Mark Bergen, who just wrote a book about YouTube that is getting published next week, and like talking about the book and how he went about it. And that to me is so cool. And just being surrounded by so many talented people and getting to learn from them is really, really rewarding. And that's something that I really enjoy at Bloomberg. Certainly something to be said about being able to pick up the phone and be like, hey, I'm from Bloomberg, and people will know where you work, as opposed to like, hey, I'm from jasonschreier.substack.com. I think there are a lot of advantages. And like, if I ever I mean, I'm at a point where I'm fortunate that Bloomberg treats me well and they give me a lot of freedom and autonomy, and like they let me pursue the stories that I want to pursue. I haven't really been told no a lot, fortunately, when I've been trying to pitch stuff and talk to them about, hey, I'm working on the scoop. Hey, I've got this feature that I want to do. They are very supportive. My editors are very good and very helpful, and transform my work and make me better. And I still feel like I have a lot to learn from people, and I just don't want to be in a position, at least right now, I don't want to be in a position where I'm just solo and having to worry about like, okay, am I going to find a freelance editor? Am I going to find a fact checker? Am I going to have to worry about dealing with like the Substack hit, the subscription hit, if I decide to take 4 weeks off to go hang out with my newborn son? Like, I don't want to think about all that stuff. So yeah, there are a lot of compelling reasons to keep me in the kind of the traditional world of journalism. And yeah, as of right now, I'm pretty happy. Like I don't think that and I also don't think that like making the change, like going, if I were to start a Substack tomorrow, I don't really think it would be good for me for a couple reasons. I mean, first of all, I don't really think that it would be I don't think I would start making like millions of dollars or anything, nor do I really want to. But also, I don't think it would be good for my work to be forced to write on a certain cadence for people. I really like having the freedom to not have to do that, and to be able to be like, okay, look, this, I'm going to spend a week on the story, and maybe it'll work out and maybe it won't. And maybe I'll have just put a bunch of time into something, and my editors are going to be cool with that because they trust me and they know that I'm still going to output work, even if this one doesn't happen to work out. So, yeah, a lot of compelling reasons for me to stick around, and I like my job. I'm pretty happy there.
Yeah, I totally respect that answer. Obviously, I've made different decisions in my career than you in this point, but nonetheless, like different priorities.
Yeah, nothing
so
against the independent route, especially for someone like you, who, I mean, ESPN has, as I'm sure you can attest, it has its own pros and cons for sure. And I think that one important thing I should say is that Bloomberg, a lot of times when mainstream media organizations have tried to get into games, they've done a half-ass way of doing it. They haven't put in the resources. They like bury the game section somewhere and then complain when it doesn't get any traffic, or like barely give any promotion to stuff. I have found the complete opposite at Bloomberg. Like they are all in about the games industry. They are like interested in the publicly traded companies, especially, but they're interested in the work that I'm doing. They're very happy with it. I got a nice shout out a couple of weeks ago when I did a big story on Rockstar. Got a nice shout out by like the organization at large. And also we just hired Cecilia, my former colleague, to cover games also. So like Bloomberg is very interested in covering the video game industry and giving it the resources it deserves. And that alone is like a really compelling reason to be part of a big mainstream organization, is that they're actually taking it seriously. They're not just like, hey, this video game industry thing, let's throw a couple of freelance dollars at it every so often.
You have to know what you are, know what you're not. And I would say I've spoken about this at length over the past couple of years, but ESPN had a real problem at figuring that out. And I feel like a lot of media companies in the game space don't understand the level of depth you have to have either. I think one thing that you all do quite well at Bloomberg now, and even when Cecilia was at Wired, and their games department is much smaller than Kotaku, which is a full-on game trade publication itself. It's y'all are very good at where is it important for the two of you to spend time and sort of the big beat stories that are worth your time, not trying to write everything and anything about gaming, which that actually is corollary to the independent life. Like figure out where you're mattered most.
Yeah, agreed. And that's what brings in the traffic, and that's what resonates with people, is doing stories that you think matter most to people. And I mean, sometimes it doesn't, but yeah, it's an effective approach is to do what Bloomberg is allowing us to do, which is like, we have our baseline stuff, like we have to do our earnings reports every 3 months because that's what our audience expects. But other than that, we're pretty much free to do what we want. And Cecilia is pursuing her beats, which she's really fascinated by, and I'm pursuing my beats that I'm fascinated by. And it's worked out nicely so far, I think.
Well, that makes me happy that you guys are given the freedom. So we are going to start taking audience questions. We have one with someone that so that they couldn't make it. So I'll read that one, and then we'll start promoting up folks who have asked them and can ask them over voice. So I'll read this first one. This is from Ian Gertler. I hope I pronounced that right. Jason, do you see emerging tech areas like blockchain, Web3, and especially metaverse as more reinforcing or challenging for gaming?
Neither. I see them as kind of irrelevant to gaming, unfortunately. And I've had a lot of conversations with people who are working in Web3 gaming space, and they're nice people, and I feel for them because I just think that this is a giant bubble. It's already really bursting, but it's gonna get worse before it gets better because there's just zero. It's like the way I always describe it is like there's a solution that doesn't actually have a problem. It's a solution to a problem that doesn't actually exist. The idea of like Web3 gaming and blockchain and play to earn, all that stuff. And there's no appetite for it among people who actually play games. And so inherently it's all going to fail. Like there's a lot of money that's poured into this stuff and a lot of people are going to lose their jobs. Unfortunately, a lot of companies are going to shut down. But it's all just VC puffery right now. And it's been several years and nobody has come up with a single game that makes play to earn fun or interesting or appealing to people. And the big test case that everyone pointed to, Axie Infinity, which got all these puff pieces last year about how it was really changing the world and people were finally playing games and making money off of it, that bubble just burst pretty hard. And then people started to realize, oh, wait a minute, this isn't actually a fun game. And the people who are playing it are essentially serfs who are working for like rich people and making them more money. And God, what a disaster. It's all a disaster. And I would encourage people who are working in the Web3 and metaverse spaces to have escape routes planned, have a plan B.
You don't think Mark Zuckerberg will be our major overlord here in the next couple of years, Jason?
Yeah, after seeing that look at when he was his France
Horizon
and Spain
Worlds,
or whatever.
Yeah.
Really good stuff.
Yeah, I recently picked up a Quest 2 like 2 weekends ago, and I will say it's incredibly fun. I have zero appetite to make my entire life be inside of that headset. It's fun
this
for what
idea of like turning this niche hobby of VR, which is a really cool niche hobby. The idea that would be the future is just like, man, it's all a disaster. It's such a mess. I can't wait till we're past this particular fad.
VR chat and VR sex games have a lot of high downloads, which is highly disturbing to me on the latter. So
that does not shock me at all.
Yeah. Anywho, all right. So we're gonna call up a question from Too Much Manga. If you would like to ask your question, and myself would like to invite them to speak. And this is the part where you turn up your phone, Jason, because you'll want to hear the audience. They have been invited, so we're just waiting for them to accept. And if not, I have their question, but prefer they ask it. Give them like another 15, 20 seconds, and if not, I'll just read it aloud. All right, I'm just going to read it aloud if they're not responding to the invite. Sorry about that, folks. Okay, so the question was, how will people start viewing the term games journalist, in quotes, as someone who is not just a, quote, games critic, quote? I feel as though the job title is still viewed as an extension of critic. I feel as if many investigative reporters are still viewed as the same people who also review games.
I don't know. Who cares? I mean, it doesn't. I don't really give much thought to how this like terminology of games journalists or critics or whatever are used. I just try to do the work and see a lot of other good people doing good work, and who cares what they're called? I prefer the term like games media or games press anyway, rather than games journalists, which has kind of like a weird undertones these days. But to get at the meat of this, I think that there's an interesting conversation to be had about like critics versus journalists, and when that line is blurred, and whether journalists should be reviewing games, which I certainly do and enjoy doing, and how journalists can talk about products and what that looks like. And I think those are interesting conversations to be had. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of good criticism out there, and there's plenty of good reporting out there, and it's only gotten better and better, this field, since I started in it. I've seen a drastic improvement, and I've seen a big like I've seen way less of the kind of like marketing friendly puffery exclusive cover reveals and previews and all that other nonsense, and I've seen a lot more real reporting and adversarial reporting and challenging work, and that's really cool to see.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. I do think the terminology is important because it separates, just like in any publication, it separates whose opinion and who's not. I think that sort of declination and labeling is really important to journalism as at large. But
It is, but the
you.
lines are so blurred. I mean, it's like, and you could get into a bigger conversation about objectivity in journalism and how, like, if you look at someone's and nobody is actually objective, because if you look at someone's story selection and how they write certain things, you can tell a lot about them no matter what. uh I remember, I mean, at Gawker Media, we were all like, it was encouraged to put your opinion on your sleeve and just be honest about it. So like, and certainly be fair and truthful and accurate and thorough in your reporting, but like be honest about your perspective on things rather than trying to obfuscate. And certainly, I mean, like when I read a New York Times, which I would say is the gold standard for reporting and is a paper that I'm a proud subscriber of and love reading, there are certain reporters there who I can read a story by them and certainly tell that they lean conservative versus others who I can certainly read and tell that they lean liberal. And trying to hide that, I think, is pointless and is not really effective.
Yeah, it's a fine line to toe, and I think especially in games, it's a little bit more difficult because we are asked to do so many different things, like we were just talking about, right? Mm-hmm. We're asked to cover such a wide sort of breadth. It's not so easy when there's such little budget to go around, especially when you're a vertical in another website, to both hire a independent reviewer and also a investigative reporter. So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a challenge that might happen, and I've never even seen this in a practical sense, but like one challenge that might happen is if you're reviewing a game negatively and then you then have to like cover that studio in some rigorous way, in some reporting way, or vice versa, you review a game positively and then have to cover that studio like in a negative way. But I don't know, that's not really a practical problem that a lot of people have dealt with.
Yeah. We have another question, and my team said that they have not responded with the ability to request speaker, so I'm just going to read this one too, which is from Curvell in the space, which is, they say, "Good night, Jason. Do you think it's possible that streaming services will make consoles obsolete in the next decade, or will consoles be a second option?" And before you answer that one, I just want to say I wrote a column about this yesterday and sort of why game streaming has been highly unsuccessful because of infrastructure issues in America. But yes, Jason, your take. Why is game streaming going to usurp consoles and make consoles irrelevant, or are we still going to see massive console releases as we have over the past couple
It's
decades?
An interesting question. I mean, I don't think we've seen Stadia come and go. We've seen Xbox experiment with it, Sony experiment with it, and to various degrees of success. Yes, you're spot on about the internet infrastructure being the biggest barrier to streaming being like a popular, widespread thing. So yeah, I don't see consoles getting replaced anytime soon. That said, I do think that we're heading towards a future that is more about ecosystems than it is about platforms. And we've seen that Microsoft already puts all their games on PC. Sony will soon be putting many of their games on PC, has already put many of their games on PC. Wouldn't be shocked if in the next 5-10 years, there's a lot more of that crossover. And it's a lot more about like, we want you to buy into the Xbox Game Pass ecosystem, no matter where you're playing it. We want you to buy into the PlayStation ecosystem, no matter where you're playing it. And consoles become less relevant. Maybe we see a future where it's more like a wide degree, like a variety of PCs or PC related like consoles that you can get. But I can see that being more of a future where we're still playing on hardware. Like streaming hasn't replaced that, but maybe it's less of like the traditional console model that we know today.
Too early at this point, which is the problem. I was doing some math yesterday of how much it costs to have a 25 megabyte per second download speed, which is the Stadia requirement, and for many others. And in the context of Facebook just shut down its Facebook gaming app, which a lot of that was also originally supposed to be quote unquote cloud gaming and streaming. playing on other devices from your phone. But,
yeah, man, I can barely, I like can barely get Wi-Fi in my whole house, like let alone like I'm prepared to stream. Yeah, it's
it doesn't seem like it's deterring the developers from trying, though. I mean, the fact that Sony now has a partnership with Backbone and is like trying to, put out this kind of console controller. I think Neil Druckmann was tweeting The Last of Us Remastered on or Last of Us Part 1 on him playing on the Sony Backbone, like couple days ago, so it doesn't seem like they're going to stop trying. It just seems like
so streaming is one thing when you're like streaming from your console to your phone in your own house. That works extremely well these days, actually. My buddy Kirk Hamilton, my podcast co-host at Triple Click, he got a PS5 streaming or PS4 like PlayStation streaming working on his Steam Deck, and so he's been like replaying all of Persona 5 on his Steam Deck before it even comes to PC, which is cool. That stuff I think there's a lot of working tech for. It's more streaming from someone else's servers like with Stadia. That is more of an issue, I think, for a lot of people.
Well, also still very difficult though to do that remotely. If you're in your own house, laying in your bed, and your PlayStation's in the living room, maybe that's easy. But
that's what I assume that's
across the country though, and trying to stream from your PlayStation, you can do that, but it's really tough.
I assume that the Backbone stuff, that's more like streaming on your phone when your PlayStation in the other room. That's more what it's like geared towards.
I would be curious to ask some of the PlayStation people that. Maybe that's a different topic for a different day. So we'll end on this one because apparently Space is just being buggy with invites. Generally, this is from DG, and it is, what do you think about Sony's acquisition of Capcom, and will Sony hit back Microsoft's Bethesda acquisition? I guess catch up in market share is how I would translate the last part of that question.
Wait, what? Sony's acquisition of Capcom?
Did they acquire Capcom?
No.
Are we being asked fake news here?
Yes, that's a fake question.
Okay.
Bad news for you, buddy.
Okay. Good.
Oh,
good
the
know.
Question is it possible in the future? I don't know.
Okay. There was some sort of like news report from earlier in the year that said that they might acquire Sega, Capcom, Square, and From Software.
Sure. Yeah, sure. And Amazon is buying EA. I don't know if you've heard.
Yeah. Sorry there, folks. I got knocked out of the space quickly. Thank you, phone. Anyway,
no, it wasn't a fake question. Reading the question, it was like, is it possible? Which is a fine question, but yeah.
Okay. I guess the other part of that, do you think we've seen them acquire Bungie, but do you think there's more market share out there for Sony to nab that makes sense to catch up with Microsoft? Because it feels like Microsoft has far and away put themselves so much higher in sort of this modern day console war of land grabbing IP.
Sure. I mean, Microsoft is like $1 trillion company, and Sony is like several $billion, like tens of $1 billion company. So it's not really, they're not playing on the same field. That's for sure. So, no, not really.
Okay. That's it's the anticlimactic answer, but it's the one I agree with and I've written about. So nonetheless, Jason, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your insights here.
Sure.
If this is the first time you're listening to Visionaries, you can catch the rest of the podcast on our feeds, which are pinned to our Twitter account at Overcome. We've had a bunch of high-profile folks, my Higa, Atrioc, a bunch of others that were really, really great interviews, so I would implore you to go listen. And tomorrow, we're different scheduled this week, thanks to Mr. Beast. But tomorrow, we have Ludwig joining us earlier in the day, because he's a busy man. But Ludwig will be joining us for an hour tomorrow afternoon, so you can find more info about that on the Overcome account as well. So look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow. And thanks for tuning in tonight. Have a good night, everyone. That's all for our show. If you enjoyed this episode of Visionaries, please leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Special thanks to Sammy Day and Prem Thodamkara for their help on this episode. And this week, we're changing up our schedule a little bit. On Friday, we will have an interview out with Ludwig, one of the top streamers in the world. So we'll see you then.